strange thing. Having said that, I will turn it over to Brother Jason and shake him on Francis of Assisi.
Well, good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I know you're all doing well. Thank you so much for this invite. I'm so pleased to be here. I have to ask if anybody, does everybody mind if I'm kind of muffled? May I take off my?
Yes.
Okay. I am fully vaccinated. I have all my shots. And I'll try to keep my distance, but this way I feel I'm a little bit more clear here. So thank you so much for being here. Again, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being so welcoming to this wonderful parish community. I'm so glad to be here this morning. And I figure we'll start out appropriately enough with a prayer from St. Francis. This is actually my favorite prayer of his. It's from a letter to the entire order. So this is Francis writing to his brothers. So let's just begin here. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty, eternal, just, and merciful God, give us the grace to do for you alone what we know you want us to do, and always to desire what pleases you. Inwardly cleansed, interiorly enlightened, and inflamed by the fire of the Holy Spirit, may we be able to follow in the footprints of your beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, and by your grace alone, may we make our way to you, Most High, who live and rule in perfect Trinity and simple unity, and are glorified God Almighty forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And so this little pamphlet that I just prayed from is a little pamphlet. There's stuff back here, and so feel free to grab one. There's a couple others as well. So I figure this is a good opportunity not only to talk about St. Francis, but to maybe talk about the vocation office as well. So these are actually vocation materials. Now I don't want to make any assumptions, but a lot of you don't seem like you're kind of vocation ages for the. That's all right. This is all still
half
great.
the room are female too. So.
That's true. That's true. Yes. So we're a little outside of the demographic, but feel free to grab one anyway. Maybe just passive aggressively hand it to somebody you think might be a good friar. I find this one too. I often get asked the question, how do you become a friar? This is a wonderful little booklet that they came up with, and it kind of goes step by step. What the kind of the process is. So I always find that very interesting. Whether or not you're discerning a vocation or not, it's just very, very helpful. St. Francis' prayer book goes without saying is a wonderful little thing. And then there's also probably St. Francis' most famous writing is the Canticle of the Creatures, or the Canticle of Brother Sun, where he praises the sun and the moon as brother and sister. There's a little pamphlet back there. Feel free to grab any of those. And then there's also just a little bit of an introduction to who are the friars in the United States. So this little pamphlet goes through all of that. So again, feel free. They're back there. I also brought along some of the only a small fraction of the Franciscan sources of my kind of personal books or books that I use for workshops or things like that. They're back there as well. I need those back. You can take these home. Yeah. I need the other books, but feel free to get up and take a look at those. The way that I see this presentation, this isn't class. Nobody's taking this for credit. So feel free to get up, go to the bathroom, get up, grab a booklet, get up, get a cup of coffee, anything like that. That won't offend me, right? And the other thing that I have to sort of say at the very beginning, I know I'm going to talk about St. Francis. You're going to get a bonus. There's no extra charge or anything like that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about St. Clare, because I think she's very, very vital to understanding the Franciscan charism, particularly as it's incarnated in a female charism, right? So I think that's really, really important, and so I'm going to talk about her a little bit. She doesn't really get a whole lot of airtime, and I think that's really unfortunate because she's an awesome saint. So if we have time, we'll talk about her as well. Does that sound good? Good. Great. So again, my name is Brother Jason Damon. Just a little bit about myself, so you're like, who's this weird guy that's talking to us? I'm from Buffalo originally. My car is very easy to pick out in the parking lot. It's the one with all the Bills paraphernalia. So I'm a huge Bills fan and Sabres fan. They're both doing well for the moment. I don't think the Sabres are going to continue on, but who knows, miracles can happen. So I went to St. Bonaventure University, which is Siena's sister school, or as I like to sometimes tease the people from Siena, and it gets at them because there's this inferiority complex that I like to pick at. It's the mother school. It's not the sister school, it's the mother school. And so I sometimes like to pick on people like that. The last 3 years I've been in Chicago working on my graduate degree in theology, and I requested to come here. This is kind of the Franciscan version of what we would say for a lot of diocesan priests, the pastoral year. And I requested to come Siena. I love working with young adults. I figure as I'm a young adult myself, it's a good demographic to work with. And so I've been here since May, so I'm fairly new. I'm one of the new guys at the Friar. So, and I also dramatically have brought down the median age of the friars that work there. So absolutely pleased to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. So just a couple of reminders. Again, nothing here is set in stone. There's not anything that I think, okay, if you don't come away with this, then I've failed as a presenter. Or don't feel free, don't worry about asking a question or saying, hey, wait, can we go back to this? Or can we go down this path or whatever? Feel free to ask questions, right? There's nothing set in stone. There's nothing that I came in here thinking, I absolutely need to communicate this. I have a little bit of, as you can tell, a presentation. That's really just more or less to keep me on track. I have a tendency to wander down lanes. I don't want to drag you all along, but if you want to go down those lanes, I'm happy to accompany you, right? So just remember that nothing is set in stone. This is also, this is a brief presentation, so we're only going to really scratch the surface, right? So feel free, if there's something that particularly interests you and you want, okay, let's check that out a little bit more. That's great. Also, I'm not very good at just standing here and talking to people. Like if you have questions, I see this as a dialogical process, right? So if there are things that you want to know more of, or you want to have a conversation about, absolutely feel free to do that. I don't have a thing where I'm going to, a discursive list of things that I'm going to talk to you about St. Francis about, right? So please ask questions, comment anytime. Briefly, I'd like to maybe just go, again, I mentioned that we're going to talk about both Francis and Clare here. We'll briefly go over the life of St. Francis. Again, any questions are welcome. And then kind of a period where we sort of digest Francis's life and charism, and then we'll talk about the life of St. Clare, if that's cool with everyone, right? And then I'll sort of end, my understanding is this a big piece for the program here that you have, is what did the saints of yesterday teach us today, right? So how does this charism have an impact on us as Catholics today? So we'll discuss that a little bit too. Does that sound good to everybody? Any questions, comments, screams of outrage?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yes, it's still early. So all right. So let's. So obviously, and I even noticed on your the little the bulletin for today that St. Francis was there, right? And so St. Francis is often viewed in these even people that don't have any sort of kind of religious sensibility at all. A lot of them will know St. Francis. Somebody once told me a story of they were trying to sell their house, and they had a lot of like these little statues and angel artwork and stuff like that, and the realtor said, you need to get rid of all of that, you need to take that all down. There's a little statue of St. Francis out in the garden, that was okay, that could stay, right? So everything else had to go with St. Francis could stay. And so like there's often this very beautiful artwork around him. I feel bad for the guy, because every time you see him, in like a garden or a bird bath or whatever, he always has like bird poop all over his face. But like, he's everywhere, right? Like he's pretty omnipresent, right? Like he's all over the place, and a lot of people have a familiarity with him, right? So, but before he was sort of this great holy saint that a lot of people could connect to, a lot of people could relate to, he was more like this. So this is not a historically accurate picture, but I figured like this is a good. Before he was St. Francis as we know him, Francis Bernardoni was kind of a party boy. He was kind of a playboy. He was born to some very wealthy people in Assisi, Italy, right? So he's from Assisi. His father was a cloth merchant. And not to get too in depth about sort of the socioeconomic situation of the time, but there was sort of a lot of economic historians would say this is sort of a period of time where this concept of a middle class is starting to develop, right? Like in the Middle Ages, obviously, you had people who were very rich, and you had people who were very poor, and there wasn't a whole lot of middle ground, right? And sort of a lot of people would say this is sort of the beginning of this kind of nascent, middle class or upper middle class. However, you still had to be sort of noble birth to really be kind of in part of the nobility and stuff like that. Francis's father really probably had a deep desire for his family, obviously, to be that, right? And so he was a cloth merchant. He made a lot of money. He was pretty wealthy. Francis was born in a family of especially at the time period, relative means, right? And so he was, again, in his youth, he was kind of a party boy, a playboy. He was the guy that would pick up the tab at the bar. He was the guy that would kind of be the life of the party. He was, he chased girls. He liked to, so he was kind of all this stuff. He also had this great desire to be a knight, right? Very romantic. He had even from a young age, we sort of see this romanticism in him, right? So he had this great desire to be a knight. He wanted to be, known. He wanted to have all this money, and so this is sort of who he was before he was that, bird bath kind of saint that we figured that we see today, right? So again, he had this very strong desire to be a knight, and a lot of people at the time period that was common, and so Italy, as we know it today, wasn't kind of the unified country of Italy, right? A lot of these city-states were at war with one another constantly. They were constantly fighting each other, and so kind of the medieval version of like Albany, Siena was like Assisi and Perugia, right? And so like that was sort of the big kind of rivalry, except that unlike Albany and Siena, there was like deaths and stuff. But there was this big rivalry, and they would often fight each other in war, right? And Perugia isn't even all that far away. If you've been to Assis, you can you look out of the valley and you can see it, right? It's kind of like the next door neighbor. It would be like Albany and not even Schenectady, right? Like they were sort of like they had this rivalry, and so at one point when Francis was very young, as a young man, there was this war broke out between Assisi and Perugia. And so Francis thinks, okay, and obviously, again, this is all, I want to emphasize, I'm skating over a lot of things, right? So I'm giving you a simplified version. But Francis sort of says, oh, this is my chance, right? So he, like a lot of young men, got ready for war, and he tried to get this, he was, again, very romantic, went into it with the sense of this is a chance for glory, this is a chance to sort of stand up for my city-state, this is a chance to go out there and get my name out there. And what happens is him and a bunch of other of the young men of Assisi go out there and they get absolutely demolished. They get absolutely crushed. Perugia, really massacres a lot of the people. Francis himself is taken prisoner. He sees a lot of his friends die on the battlefield, and he's taken prisoner himself, and he stays in prison for about a year. Right? And during this time, he developed some sort of sickness. We don't really know what it was. Some people have posited maybe malaria or some sort of thing. He got sick, and that would sit with him for the rest of his life. He would go through kind of these bouts of sickness. And so he's languishing in a prison for a year. Right? And eventually his father is able to pay the ransom, and get him out of prison, able to pay to sort of get him kind of a prisoner swap, a prisoner exchange. He was able to pay his way out for his son. But Francis is different by this point. He's changed, obviously. He's had this really traumatic experience of war. He's finding out that this isn't sort of this glorious profession that I thought it was. And he comes back, and he's just a very changed guy. And his friends notice. The friends that are still alive kind of notice. He's not as interested in going out and partying and stuff like that. He still does. He still tries. He tries his best, but he's different. He's changed. And over time, he starts to really, spend a lot more time in quiet, spend a lot more time in solitude. He's not really interested in hanging out in these big groups as much anymore. And so eventually, what he does is he goes through life, and there's a couple of profound conversion points. And again, this is overly simplified. We often think of conversion as sort of this one point where it's like, okay, now I'm different. And obviously, I don't think I have to tell any of you, but conversion's a process, right? It's an ongoing process, and it lasts all of our life. There's two big moments that I want to point out in the life of St. Francis. One is his encounter with a leper. Lepers in the Middle Ages were obviously, they were an incredibly despised segment of the population, right? They were feared, really. People didn't really know. There was no germ theory back then. They didn't really understand how diseases spread. And so lepers were very, very feared, including by St. Francis. And they would have to wear bells on themselves, right? So if you heard them coming, they're supposed to get off the road. Like they were, when you developed leprosy, they would literally hold a funeral for you. Basically hold this funeral service and then kick you out of the city. So lepers had to live outside the walls of the city, which obviously, again, in the Middle Ages was a very dangerous place to be, outside the walls, right? And so they had to wear these, so they were the marginalized of the marginalized. They were literally subhuman by that point. They were people to be avoided. They were people dead to society. Francis at one point has this very profound experience where he encounters a leper, and instead of jumping off to the side of the road like he did before, like everybody did, he stands there and he embraces the leper, right? And so I've always wondered what that would have been like for that leper to sort of, he's so used to, again, being ignored, being not only ignored but marginalized and sort of dead to the world. Francis embraces him. And that's a point that at the end of his life, in his last testament, that's a key point for him. He said, what was once hateful to me, what was once disgusting becomes sweet, right? And that is something that at the end of his life he's reflecting on, and he looks back at that moment and he says, that was a big one for me, right? Yeah.
Did Francis at that point, do we know much about him in terms of his religious orientation
Sure.
at that point? Because the obvious thing is the connection with Jesus and the stories relative to lepers, right?
Right. No, that's a great question. Francis, like pretty much everybody in Italy at the time period, would have gone to Mass. Like it was impossible to escape the influence of the church, right? There was, even today in Assisi is a small little city, there's like a dozen chapels. Like you turn around the corner, there's another chapel. And like, so Francis, like anybody, like would have grown up under this influence. He knows Francis, by the way, because he was the son of a merchant, he had some literacy. He was probably, a scholar put it best as, he was somewhere between fully literate and illiterate, right? So he probably has some sort of, like, if we think of like maybe a second or third grade level. So he could write and he could read, but it wasn't very, very good. But a lot of what he was able to remember, when he writes these rules, where he dictates to others, really, because he didn't write in his own hand so much. We have a few documents of his, but mostly he's dictating, and you could see, like, there's a really well-formed biblical understanding, right? Like he's like, these make an impact, and obviously a lot of that was, post, conversion, if you will.
Right, sure.
But obviously a lot of that was formed in the kind of his early days, right? He's probably, we know where he was baptized, at San Rufino. It's a church called San Rufino, and he probably went to school there, right? So he's probably taught a little bit of Latin there. So he had this sort of contact, if you will, with religion. And obviously it was impossible to avoid. There was lots of saint days feast days that got celebrated. But that wasn't obviously a big part of his life, right? At least at that point. It was his life was about kind of money, and following his dad's will and stuff like that. By the way,
Can you mention, I should know this, what's the date range of his life?
Of his life?
Just approximately.
Yeah, that's a great question. So he was born in either 1181 or 1182, we don't quite know, and he dies in 1226.
Okay.
Right, so he's sort of the late 12th century, early 13th. Right?
Thank you.
And by the way, something I failed to mention, his dad was away when he was born. His dad was on a business trip to France. Francis was born, baptized John. He was named after John the Baptist, right? So his baptismal name was John. When his dad returned, because his dad would go to France a lot, basically gives him this name Francesco, which means like Frenchy, little Frenchman or whatever, basically. And so that's the name that he becomes known as is Francesco. But his baptismal name was actually Giovanni, right? And so but again, his mother was very religious. His dad, probably not so much, but his mom was Pieta, was very religious. And so he probably would have had an influence of that too, right? His mother's impact and stuff. So those are both really great questions. So probably a little bit, he probably would have been like a lot of people today, where it's like culturally Catholic, like you go to Mass once in a while. My brother's like that, right? Like my brother's not necessarily practicing, but he'll go to Mass to make my mom happy or whatever. So he's probably, again, my conjecture would be he was probably around there, right? But these impacts on his life, being in prison and getting sick, this impact with the leper, right? This influence with the leper. And then this last thing that I want to talk about, again, kind of a big moment in his life, point of conversion in his life, is that at one point he's kind of coming back from a trip, and he stops at this deserted little chapel right outside the walls of Assis. And the chapel is called San Damiano. And so he stops in this little chapel, and he's there praying. And he hears this voice saying, Francis, go rebuild my church, which as you can see is falling into ruin. Right? And so this chapel, this is actually the crucifix that he saw. This is hanging now in the Basilica of St. Clare. So this is the actual crucifix that he saw, the San Damiano cross. It's also all over, every room actually in Siena is supposed to have this crucifix. Right? And so he encounters this, and he has this moment of, profound connection to Jesus. And he says, great, no, I can do that. I can go fix the church. And he literally starts rebuilding the physical church, right? And so this little kind of a dilapidated little church, and he goes out. He tries to collect money. He goes in bags. Tries to get stuff from from people. Tries to get money from people. And he goes back to the priest there, and he says, look, I have all this money. And the priest is terrified of his father's influence. So the priest is like, he's just like, no, that's all right, thank you, but no thank you, And Francis is getting a lot of that money by basically selling his dad's stuff at cut rate prices, right? Like he's sort of like a black market guy, like trying to and so his dad is starting to be really, starting to get really upset with him. And on one level you can sort of understand that, if your dad, every parent has hopes and dreams for their children, right? And so his dad thought, this guy's going to be, he's going to succeed me, and this family is going places. We have our name out there, we're building a reputation. My son is very charismatic. He seems to like people. He seems to get along with people, and he's going to take over for me. And he comes back from the war, and he's very different, right? And so he comes back from the war, and he's spending a lot of time by himself, and he's not interested in the things that he used to be, and now he's kind of really messing with the dad's business model. And so the dad is starting to understandably get really upset and says, look, give me back that money, or we're done. I'm gonna disown you. And so what Francis does is he goes to this is the embrace of the leopard, by the way. What Francis goes to the bishop in the public square, and we still see this in the CC. Goes to the public square, and he has this confrontation with his father, and he says, you know what? You take everything. Here's the money, and he takes off. He physically takes off all his clothes. He puts in a pile and says, I'm not going to call you my father anymore. I'm going to say I only have one Father, our Father who art in heaven. Right. And so the bishop embraces him with the mantle. You see that. And so from this point onward, Francis, and we don't really know, but probably never really reconciled with his father. And so so it was kind of a rough situation. At one point, actually, the father, prior to sort of him divesting, the father held him in prison for a while, and the mom released him. Basically trapped him in the basement. It was you're not going anywhere, what's wrong with you, whatever, and so kind of freaks out, puts him in the basement, keeps him there for a while, and the mom eventually has pity on him and releases him, and Francis goes back and does the same things that he's been doing. He's basically taking money from his dad's shop and selling them, and trying to fix churches, and hanging out with lepers, and so all these, so the father finally has enough, and there's this confrontation in the public square of Assisi, and Francis strips of all of his stuff and says, I don't consider you my father. And sort of there's kind of this very, very public, very painful thing. We don't know a lot about Pietro, the dad. Some people have suggested he might have been abusive. I think a lot of that might be conjecture. You really have to read between the lines. This is a thing by an artist called Giotto, by the way, who did the frescoes in Assisi, the Basilica of St. Francis. And so there's suggestions of the dad was kind of you see him kind of holding up a hand back, right? And there's suggestions that maybe the dad was abusive, but we don't really know. Anyway, it was a very kind of messy split in his family. But from that point onward, Francis is basically living as a hermit, right? He's basically living this life of poverty. He's going around and begging. He's going around and trying to get money for this kind of church rebuilding campaign, right? And so he's going out, and he's going out and he has the split. He's not the son of the merchant anymore. He's become this social pariah. He's kind of the weird guy that stripped in front of the bishop, and now he's kind of trying to beg for food and fixing churches. And so for actually quite a a couple of years he lives like this, right? So he basically, and again, this is the Cliff Notes version, right? Like this is the, this is not the, the teachers would be very upset that we're not like reading a lot of this stuff. This is the students kind of going online to Wikipedia and giving them Wikipedia. But for sake of brevity, we'll kind of play that game. And so after a while, though, he starts to attract people. People are sort of attracted to this way of life for one reason or another. They sort of see this formerly wealthy guy who seems happy as can be, kind of living with nothing, right? And so he starts to attract a couple of followers. He didn't set out living that way. He wanted to be basically a hermit. But he starts attracting these followers, right? And so these followers started coming to him. One of the first ones was actually a wealthy noble himself, who figured, this guy seems happy. Like this guy seems to know he has something that I don't, right? And so he follows him, and so he starts living the life. They start to live this very primitive life together, right? And then more and more over time, gradually, more and more people start to join. He's still living in the vicinity of Assisi. It was probably painful for both him and his parents, who, there's stories where, his dad would see him and just basically just turn purple with anger and have to storm away, right? And so, so basically he and these early brothers are living this very kind of primitive way of life. And so, just a kind of a historical note, there were a lot of movements like Francis's going on at the time. This is a time where a lot of followers were they saw some of the wealth of the church and they were scandalized. And so there was a number of followers or a number of movements who tried to emphasize living with very little, serving the marginalized and the poor, and some of them, yeah.
I went to Assisi, and I was so disappointed because it seemed like it was all gold everywhere. It was just the exact opposite of what Francis stood for. And I don't know if other people who went there had the same reaction.
Yeah.
I just remember all the hills.
There's a lot of those. You get your calves burned out, that's for sure. But actually, when they built the Basilica of St. Francis, a lot of the early followers in particular were like, what's that about? Like first of all, it would have been very ugly to an Italian. It was very formal. It was a very different style architecturally than they had in Italy at the time. So they would have been like, first of all, the thing's ugly. Second of all, that's not what Francis stood for. Like that's, and so a lot of them were actually very, very scandalized themselves, a lot of the early followers. And for a long time, there was one of the things that we take vows of, that's what the knots on my cord stand for, is chastity, poverty, and obedience. Chastity and obedience seem pretty straightforward, right? Like those are pretty straightforward things. There's a depth to them, right? But there's a simplicity. Poverty is what friars have always argued about, and so why there's a million different Franciscan groups. A lot of it boils down to one group says, well, you're not really living poverty, or a group says, you're not living like Francis would have wanted us to live in this day and age. And so they kind of split off and they form these other groups. And so now there's a million different, kind of breakout Franciscan groups, unfortunately, because that was something that was never really, even within Francis's lifetime, we'll talk a little bit about that. A lot of these, the order starts going in a different direction. And so that was really painful for a lot of people, including the early followers. So you're not the only one that's disappointed. There was a lot of, especially a lot of the early brothers were like, this is a betrayal of Francis's ideals, right? So.
Why was that done?
Why was it done?
Who did that, and why did they do it sort of contrary to, what sort of the beliefs are, and who did the architecture that's sort of the Italian architecture?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that there's a lot. That's a very complicated question, but essentially, it kind of to me it boils down to. I think a big part of it is, so Francis again didn't set out to form a religious order. He started and a lot of other people followed. So at the end of, if you can see at the beginning of the presentation right here, you see the OFM after my name, right? So does anybody know what that stands for? Yeah, very good. So Order of Friars Minor, or Order of Lesser Brothers, right? So Dominican, you know what the initials would be after his name? OP, good. What does that stand for?
Order of Preachers.
Order of Preachers. Exactly. There's a apostolic bent to it, right? So Dominic set out. He did want to. By the way, Francis and Dominic were contemporaries. They lived at the same time. Dominic set out, and he had a very clear vision of what he wanted. He wanted to form an order, and he wanted to form a preaching order because a lot of people at the time didn't really have a good catechetical background. They weren't receiving preaching, right? They didn't really know any of the doctrinal stuff. And so he said, you know what we need, this church needs, is an order dedicated to good preaching and live simply. And so they take actually a lot of, they live a lot of, they also are mendicant and itinerant, right? And so, but they said, what the church needs is good preaching. Francis didn't take a look and say, you know what we need is lesser brothers, right? Like that kind of developed over time. And so for Franciscans, we are so much of our charism is dominated by St. Francis, right? Who's, and how do you interpret that, right? So Order of Preachers, like that's pretty, again, that's not always easy, but it's straightforward. It's like that's what our charism is about, is learning and teaching and preaching, right? The friars don't have necessarily a charism. The Vincentians have a charism where it's serving the poor, right? That's pretty straightforward. We don't have that, right? And so it gets very complicated because it comes down to how do we interpret living the life of St. Francis in our day and age, right? And so if you ask a friar that question, if you ask 5 friars that question, Franciscan friars, you're going to get five different answers, right? Because like, what does that look like, right? And so I think that's kind of the tough part, right? Is how do we live this with integrity while staying in community? Right? There's things, even right now, in my fraternity, that I'm like, I don't know if I agree with that, but I'm more than, before anything else, I'm a lesser brother, right? So I'm called to be a brother to them, right? So that unity is really, to me, what matters more than anything. And so, yeah, but there's other people other Franciscan groups where, these splits occur, these sometimes very painful splits occur because you're not living like what St. Francis would. Well, you're not living like what St. Francis. Well, you're not living with like what St. Francis would do, right? And so, and for a while, actually, Francis kind of fades in the background for actually several hundred years, right? Like, so he becomes kind of almost a mythical figure. He's not really. People aren't kind of meditating on his readings and writings and things like that. Obviously, that's a big part of my formation. But 200 years ago, that wasn't a big part of friar formation. And so yeah.
Just, when you said you're a lesser brother, can you just clarify that? I'm not.
Sure.
Is that
so
the hierarchy?
So Francis, so a lesser brother would basically, and it's kind of an awkward phrasing, right? Friar minor. Francis would often write his, little brother Francis. That's how he referred to himself. And so lesser brothers basically means we're at the service of others, right? Like we're not to seek positions of authority. We're supposed to be lesser. We're supposed to be servant leaders, right? We're not supposed to. Actually, Francis was very much against friars. There was actually a conversation very early on in the order of should friars get an education or not, right? Because like especially in that day and age, an education meant that you would sort of gain some status, and Francis was very against kind of people of status, right? Like, or not against people of status, he was against him being a person of status, right? And so,
Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Are you gonna tell us the quotation about St. Francis in the book in the shelf?
What is that one?
Oh, I can't remember it exactly, but St. Francis, as far as being educated and being one of the higher orders, I've seen this story that St. Francis says if friars have books, pretty soon they'll want shelves to put them on, and then pretty soon you got a whole library.
Right, and so that was a big, so he, and actually in our rule, he's basic, or in our in our rule, he said, if people are learned when they come in, great. If they're not, they shouldn't be overly eager to be educated, right? Like, so he was kind of like, it's this tension there, right? And so that's the other thing is, The best biography that I've read about St. Francis was by Andre Vaucher. It's called St. Francis of Assisi, The Life and Afterlife of a Medieval Saint. Fantastic, it's phenomenal. And he has this line that always stuck with me, he said something along the lines of St. Francis, like everybody else, had contradictions that only he himself could justify. Right? And I think that's true for all of us, right? But when you get into how are we interpreting St. Francis, that becomes very messy, right? And that becomes very difficult. And so it's not always a very straightforward thing. Francis was kind of cunningly simple, right? Like he had a lot of simplicity about him, but there's a depth to his theology, right? It's not one that he maybe would have articulated. It's certainly not in the words that we would have, you know, in over time, right? Like there's 2 volumes of books back there that I brought of documents either from him or about him within the early days of the order, right? So, yeah, right. So it's complicated. It's always complicated to answer that question. Did I answer this sufficiently?
Yes.
Very cool. So again, we'll sort of. I'm cognizant of time, so we'll sort of speed read a little bit. So he goes from again fixing churches and begging, right? And so like these early brothers, eventually he starts gaining a little bit of a following. And again, at this time period, it wasn't uncommon for itinerant and mendicant orders to sort of pop up, or movements, I should say, rather than orders to pop up. The problem was a lot of them were heretical. Either they thought that there was a good God that created the spirit, and there was an evil God that created the material world, right? And so, like there was some of that going on, and then there was also a lot of movements that were like antagonistic toward the Catholic Church and the Pope and the bishops, and so you can imagine that did not go over well either with the hierarchy. And so eventually, what happened was there was 12 followers, like Francis said, had these early followers by 1209, right? So like this early, like the war with Perugia was around 1202, I think, 1203. So he starts kind of undergoing this conversion. 1206, he's starting to live by himself. He has this confrontation with his father. A couple of years later, there's brothers that are starting to join, right? And so Francis gets kind of advice from the bishop that says, look, you might want to go to the Pope and sort of make sure that he's cool with this, right? Like you might want to go and check that out and like get his blessing, get his approval. And so what happens is 1209, Francis and the first brothers, they go to Rome, right? And so they go to Rome, and the Pope at the time was actually one of the most powerful popes in history, Innocent III. Very kind of intimidating man in a lot of senses. He would have had, obviously the education system was different, he would have had like basically a doctorate in both law and theology, right? He was pretty young when he was elected, actually. And so he was a very, very powerful guy. And so he at one point put the entire country of England under interdict, because he had a conflict with the king, and so he put the entire country under interdict for like a year. And so like he was very powerful, kind of a lot of people would consider that maybe the apex of the medieval papacy, was Innocent III. So Francis and his brothers are kind of walking in there with no shoes, trying to say like, hey, like we want to talk to you about something. And the hagiography is basically Innocent or the cardinals basically say, this must be a joke, get out, right? Like, and there's this again, hagiographical story where one of them says, you know what, go sleep with the pigs, because you're dirty, you're smelly, you're dressed like a pig, go sleep with the pigs. Francis goes, okay. And so he and the brothers go out and they sleep in the pig pen. And Innocent III, that night, again, hagiographical story, Innocent III has this dream where there's this church that's falling and there's this little guy that's holding it up, right? And so he wakes up and he realizes, wait, that's the guy, right? Like that's the guy that I think that I saw in that dream last night. Bring him back here, right? And actually that scene of Francis, that dream of Francis holding up the church, right? There's a statue in Rome of, it was built by an Italian ruler who had a great fondness for Francis, and it's Francis and he's going like this. And if you stand behind him in a certain way, you can see him holding up the Basilica of St. John Lateran. It's actually very cool. That leader actually was, again, great fan of St. Francis of Assisi. He at one point said that St. Francis of Assisi was the most saintly of all Italians and the most Italian of all saints. That man's name was Benito Mussolini. So that should show you the difference between being a fan and being a follower, right? Like there's a very sharp distinction. So, but anyway, there's this, again, this very cool statue of him kind of holding it up. And so Francis comes in, he gets verbal approval of the rule, right? So the Pope gives him a blessing. They get tonsures at this point, which are those hideous haircuts with the circle haircuts. Thankfully, I never had to have one. Although actually, back in the day, so like prior to like Vatican II, a lot of the novices still had to get that. And so I lived with a friar in Chicago who was talking about that once. He was like, it was ridiculous. Like I had to go to the dentist one time with this stupid haircut. So anyway, they get this tonsure to basically say, look, we're members of the we're like members of the church, right? Like we're public members of the church. And he basically gives them approval. Okay, do what you're doing. Verbal approval. And so they go out, and what happens is, kind of the movements of the Holy Spirit here, is the order explodes. Like they have massive amount of people that are interested in joining this way of life. To the point where in 2017 they have to hold the first, and again, this is overly simplified, they have to hold this chapter, right? And so it's impossible to get exact numbers at that point, but some of the numbers I've seen is like 3,000 brothers. So like between 12, like they had 12 in 1209. Less than a year later, they have thousands. Right, so it's growing very, very quickly, very, very quickly, and so this order, and Francis, by the way, continues to have this desire to sort of leave Italy, like just like when he was younger, he wanted to be a knight and go off and fight the Crusades. He still wants to go out. He still wants to go. He had actually a great desire for martyrdom, which again was actually very common at the time period. Saint Anthony of Padua. Actually joined. Does anybody know the story of St. Anthony of Padua? You know who he was before he was St. Anthony?
I know he was Portuguese, but I don't.
Yeah, he's from Portugal. He's from Lisbon.
Well,
His name was Ferdinand. He was an Augustinian, right?
Oh, okay.
And so he was an Augustinian Portuguese friar. And what happens is he sees some of the early brothers in I think it was 1219 or 1220. There was some friars that got martyred in northern Africa, and their bodies get carried, and St. Anthony sees their bodies and is so moved, he said, I want to do that. I want to be a martyr like they are, right? And so, like, again, very common in the Middle Ages to sort of have this desire for martyrdom preached to the unconverted and killed for it. And so, with St. Anthony too, the poor guy, he kept on trying to go to like Africa or these places. And like one time the ship blew him off course, and so he landed, and he landed back in Italy, and they were looking for a preacher for some sort of situation. And Anthony at that point, they didn't really know the guy too well. He was like the dish boy, and they said, "Hey, do you want to do it?" And he was like, "All right, I'll do it." And he basically kills, right? Like they're like, "Wow, you're great! Like do that some more." And so like he kind of pushed Anthony into this like. This vocation that he never really asked for, but and then the only reason he's Anthony of Padua, that's where he died, right? So anyway, he's Portuguese, yeah, good. Anyway, let's see what I mean. So Francis continues to have this desire. He wants to go to France. At one point, he wants to go to Spain. Sickness keeps on getting in the way, and so he has to return back to Assisi, or he has to return to Italy. And so finally, in 1219, he gets his wish to go off, and he goes off on the Crusades. He goes to Crusades. And he goes to the city of Damietta, Egypt. And while he's in Damietta, it was again, just a really bloody situation. There was a lot of people dying, and the situation of the historical situation in the Crusades at that point is like a lot of people dying. There wasn't a whole lot of movement on either side. So it was basically like a lot of people were getting slaughtered in no man's land, right? And so Francis says, you know what? I'm going to go across the line. I'm going to talk to the Sultan. The cardinal in charge is like, okay, fine, see you later. Like you're not coming back. Like fully expects that he's going to die, but says, you know what? Get out of here, fine. And so he and a brother Illuminato go, which is an awesome name, by the way, Brother Illuminato. They go, they cross the lines and they meet with the Sultan, and to the great surprise of everybody, they are able to have this encounter, this very profound encounter in 1219 between the Sultan and this little St. Francis, right? This shoeless guy. And there's a lot been written about that. I'm not going to go too much into it. There's a lot of good books. Sultan and the Saint, or The Saint and the Sultan, I think, is one of the good ones. So there's also a little movie that was done a little while ago. But anyway, Francis has this very profound encounter with the other, and returns back to the lines, and is kind of further solidifies his commitment to peace, right, and this peacemaking. However, when he returns, so he's been away in Egypt for a while, in the desert of Egypt, and so when he returns to the brothers, he finds that they've done something really dastardly. They've built houses for themselves, and so he's very upset. And so Francis is very upset by this point, and he goes up on the roofs of the houses and starts taking them apart. He didn't want the brothers to have any sort of permanent structure, because that would interfere with what he thought was this reliance on God, right? Like this sense of detachment. He wanted to solidify this sense of detachment. And so he's very frustrated and disillusioned. He, around this time, kind of becomes, a little bit later, he will give up control, like he's no longer in charge of the order. He has to get a formal rule written. And this is kind of hard to believe, but at the time, there were so many different religious orders being formed that one of the things in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council said, okay, no more religious orders. Like, if you want to be a religious order, you can take one of the rules that's already written, because we have too many going on right here. And so the problem was Francis and the Franciscans didn't have a rule of their own at that point. And so kind of a legal fiction, and they basically go back and say, oh, no, Innocent III gave us a rule, back in 1209, right? We just didn't write it down. And so they sort of, they get this rule written. The first one, 1221, doesn't get approved. 1223 it does, right? And so the 1221 rule, very typical of Francis, it wasn't particularly well structured, right? Like it was. And it would often go off on these meandering quotations of scripture, right? And so there was a lot of scripture and then a couple lines of a rule written in between. And so the canonists in the Vatican looked at that and said, no, you need something kind of a little bit more, we need something more canonically, appropriate. And so 1223, the rule gets approved, and that's still the rule that we profess. So you can read both of those in the first, the blue book back there.
Is the rule like a mission statement, or what your?
A series of 12 chapters, 12 articles, and it goes over how do we live out this life of being a friar, right? And so I could read to you a little bit of it actually. Does anybody mind grabbing that blue book for me? But basically, what happens is this rule, and then what we have too as Franciscans, that's the rule that I profess to. But we also have what we would call the constitutions, right? And so the constitutions are a way to sort of give more meat to that. So, yeah, a little bit of both. But the rule basically kind of guides our life as friars. Thank you so much, appreciate it. But I could read you maybe a little bit of a chapter of one. So. Again, there's a lot of really beautiful writings that Francis was a part of. I don't consider the rule particularly beautiful, at least not kind of the way it's written or structured. But this is the beginning of it, right? So this is chapter 1. The rule in life of the lesser brothers is this: to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by following in obedience without anything of one's own and in chastity, right? So those are the vows of obedience, sine proprio, or poverty, right? So note that it doesn't say abject poverty here. It says nothing of our own, sine proprio, and in chastity, right? Brother Francis promises obedience and reverence to our Lord Pope Honorius and his successors canonically elected, and to the Roman Church. Let the other brothers be bound to obey Brother Francis and his successors, right? So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is titled Those Who Wish to Adopt This Life and How They Should Be Received. Then we go into the divine office, fasting, and how the brothers should go about in the world. Let the brothers never receive money. That's part of our rule. Very difficult to do in a capitalist society, by the way. The manner of working. Let the brothers not make anything their own, begging alms, the sick brothers, right? So it goes through things like that. So you could check that out. But yeah, so it basically gives structure to our life as friars. So also in 1223, so that rule gets approved, right? Also in 1223, we have a very significant, if you've ever seen a major scene, a crash scene, then you can thank this event in 1223. In the town of Greccio, Francis has this first nativity scene. So he's so again, a hallmark of Franciscan spirituality is a deep, deep, deep devotion to the incarnation, right? Incarnational spirituality is an absolute hallmark of Franciscan spirituality. And so Francis wanted to celebrate that in sort of the most, tender way that he could. And so he recreates the gospel scene, right, of the birth of Jesus, right, and celebrates that. So that is in 1223. So still today in Greccio, there's like nativity scenes from all over the world, which is really, really cool, actually. I was supposed to go there. I went to Italy when I was an undergrad at St. Bonaventure. We couldn't get up the hill. And so it was too snowy, so I was never able to go to the cave where this happened, unfortunately. Maybe I'll go back at some point. But yeah, so in this little cave, he sort of recreates this scene, right? So towards the end of his life, too, he receives what we would call, he's one of the first of what we would call the stigmatists, right? The stigmata, the wounds of Christ. So Francis, while he's on it's called Mount Laverna, he's on basically retreat. Towards the end of his life, again, he's very disillusioned with where the order is going. He's struggling with how it's living out. They're kind of, it's becoming bigger. It's becoming more institutionalized, and he's really struggling with that. And so towards the end of his life, he's spending a lot of time in solitude, trying to process this, trying to come to grips with what's happening. And so one of his good friends in the order, Brother Leo, was often his kind of companion for a lot of this stuff. And so while Francis is basically fasting and away on Mount Laverna, he receives from the seraph the stigmata, right? He doesn't tell anybody about it, but he receives the stigmata from this seraph. And so again, there's some people, some different interpretations of it. Some people are saying, well, it might have been leprosy, right? It might have been kind of these leprous wounds. He might have developed it himself. He hung around lepers a lot. It might have been made up. It might have been this, that, or the other thing, right? So that's oftentimes a matter of faith. But yeah, he receives these stigmata, the wounds of Christ. He was so devoted to the life of Jesus from birth to death that he wanted to be so conformed to that eventually towards the end of his life he receives the wounds of the passion, right? And so again, he's very, very sick. He's very ill at the end of his life. This picture in the middle, this is called the Portiuncula, or St. Mary of the Angels, but the nickname was kind of Portiuncula, the little portion. And so this little church, you can see, is inside of a massive church. This is where St. Francis eventually dies, right? And so this little church you could probably fit in this room. Like it's tiny. It was my favorite place in Assisi. They eventually built this massive basilica over the top of it. So it's like a church inside of this big, big church, massive church, right outside the bounds of Assisi. It was owned by the Dominicans. And so the early friars took that over as a place of worship. And because they didn't have any money, the Dominicans, it was a dilapidated little church. It wasn't really, where the Benedictines, Benedictines had it. They basically said, all right, well, maybe a basket of fish once a year. That'll be good. That's your rent, right? And so even still today, Franciscans will give a basket of fish to the Benedictines. And so eventually he dies on the evening of October 20 or October 3rd, right? And that's still a very special feast for us. It's called the Transitus. So the Transitus is kind of marking his death. It's a very somber celebration, but not without hope, because it's sort of this, again, kind of looking through the Paschal lens, the lens of the Paschal mystery. It's the passing over, transitus, right, passage. And so his feast day is October 4th. So we just had that not that long ago. It's always outside of Christmas and Easter for Franciscans. That's the show, right? Like that's the big deal for us. So, and that's the basilica today. Like I said, there was a lot of people that very displeased with it. But Francis is buried in the bottom level of that. Something interesting, maybe a side note that might be of note for those who are scandalized, like you said, with sort of the grandeur of some of this stuff. This would have been outside the walls during Francis's lifetime. It was only after his death that sort of they said, all right, we're going to this hill was basically known as the Hill of Hell. That's where all of the criminals would be kind of thrown when they were executed or killed or whatever. And so that basilica was built on it. And so even in death, Francis is sort of with the marginalized or the incarcerated. So, yeah. Any comments and questions so far? I know we're running short on time.
And I'll try and be brief.
Sure.
To go back to St. Francis and the Crusades, because he'd always wanted to be a crusader.
Right.
A number of years ago, there was a Franciscan who gave a program at Cathedral of All Saints, the Episcopal Cathedral in Albany, about St. Francis single-handedly won the Crusades, which was very interesting because I'd never thought of it in those terms. The point of the Crusades was to get the holy places in Israel under Christian supervision and Christian hands. And so when St. Francis went to the Sultan gave the Franciscans permission to oversee the Church of the Sepulchre and Bethlehem and all these places in the Holy Land, which is what the Crusades were actually supposed to accomplish. But here St. Francis accomplishes it without any fighting and in a very peaceful way, and the Franciscans had, for centuries on, the Franciscans were the keepers of the holy places in Jerusalem.
They still are.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
For the Roman rite, they are
Yeah.
the sort of the custodians of the Holy Land, the holy places.
Did that end the Crusades then?
Yeah. Oh,
All right, so.
no,
they had
no, there's
one
still a lot
back.
more fight. There's still, unfortunately,
Yeah, all right.
bloodshed fighting after that for hundreds of years.
At the beginning, you talked about that house and how they would, all the religious things except for Francis, it was acceptable. In this culture that's very capitalistic,
Yeah.
why do you think Francis has been able to kind of go about the institutional?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think we'll sort of, unfortunately, scarcity for a woman, but we'll get to sort of what I wanted to, because I know we're running low on time. I think there's a couple things to be noted there. First of all, St. Francis, because he's interpreted in so many different ways, some people would look at it, and in the rules he talks about being obedient to the church and always honoring clerics and things like that. So if you wanted to look at Francis and say, oh, well, here's an obedience under the church, there it is. If you want to look at Francis and look at him and say, oh, well, no, he was kind of a rebel. He was kind of on the side. You could look at him and he could be that for you, right? And so I think there's a very multifaceted dimension to Francis, and I think even Jesus gets interpreted that way too, right? Like you could use scripture to justify a lot of things, you know, and so you could use the kind of the life of St. Francis to justify a lot of things, right? And so I think that's part of it, but I think more key to why he speaks to me today, why he speaks to hopefully other people today too. One is this aspect of conversion, this understanding of who I am, that I am before God, and nothing else, right? Which is something that he wrote in the Admonitions, right? So he was able to see himself through that lens, right? He was able to understand it's not my friends and the parties and stuff like that matter. It's like that's inconsequential, really, when it comes down to it, right? Like you said today in the homily, it's like it's great to party and drink and dance, and that's fine. But what's important, right? What's important to you? What's the key to your life? And so for Francis, he was able to realize that's not what I'm about, right? Like I don't see myself that way. And so he was able to have this. I think this understanding of conversion is very important. And I think
I have to go say it again.
sure. So I think yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've run into situations where St. Francis seems to have a universal appeal.
Yeah.
I know Jews that
Right.
think he's wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, Presbyterian, I have a lot of Presbyterian friends from my school days,
Sure.
and what accounts for that?
Yeah, I think in a sense he's not threatening, right? Like he's not, he talks about being poor, simple and subject to all a lot, right? Like that's in a rule. Brothers should be simple and subject to all, right? I think that's key. I think the conversion, I think this incarnational spirituality, I just want to get into that a little bit here too, is that he was able to see joy in the midst of suffering and hardship. right? And so he was able to understand there's this story that he tells. He's walking along with a brother, and he said, you know what's perfect joy? And the brother's throwing out this thing, you know, it's this, it's that. He said, no. Perfect joy is I'm going to a friary, basically. I'm going to meet with my brothers, and I knock on the door, and the brothers say, who's there? And I say, little brother Francis. And they say, you're not Francis, get out of here. And I have to go and sleep outside in the cold, and I have to sleep outside in the mud. That's true and perfect joy. If I can have joy in that situation, that's true and perfect joy, right? So there's going to be hardship, right? And Francis experienced a lot of it. We all experienced, again, this was kind of what the readings, the gospel says today. That's what the homily was about today. It's like there's suffering, right? I don't think that means we romanticize it, but that means it's like, well, what's our anchor during all of that? And for Francis, that was the incarnation, right? Francis was so captivated with this incarnational sense, right? He saw the Eucharist as sort of a continuation of the incarnation, right? So God continues to be with us, right? Christ continues to be present to us, right? And so the Eucharist is still that kind of the continuation of God among us, God with us. And not only with us, but with us in the most humble way, right? He talks about hiding himself behind a piece of bread, right? So he's sort of, he bent, and a line from St. Bonaventure is he basically, God bends low to where we are, right? Like that's where we are. And that footprints, that first chapter that I talked about, right? The very first thing that Francis says, we're to follow the footprints of Jesus Christ, right? Like that is so, like he was very fixated on where's God right now, right? In the Canticle of the Sun, God, he's able to see God in everything, right? God is the one source of all. The sun, the moon, the criminal, death, everything. Right? God is the source of all of those things, right? And I think speaks to people a lot too. Yeah.
I'm curious about how the story of Francis lands among the students at Siena.
Yeah. I think,
Are they drawn to him? Are they puzzled by him? I know not everybody the same.
sure.
How does he play among college student age population?
I think that's a
now?
difficult thing because there's different levels of religiosity. There's different levels of interest. I asked one student, where's St. Francis of Assisi from? He said, I have no idea. I can't help you with that. You know, like, so that's one thing that's something that I try to do is talk a lot about St. Francis because I do think that is kind of a companion on a journey of faith, right? And so he's certainly been one for me, and so I want that to be the case for everybody. But yeah, it's tough to answer that question, I guess, because some people are very drawn to him, some people could care less.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird question. It's a personal question. You're obviously very devoted or whatever. I mean, did you always know that this was your direction, or how did you
I
start?
had no desire at all to be in religious life. It was not even on my radar. I went to St. Bonaventure, and I was just very captivated by the charism and by the friars there. And so I remember thinking, I could see myself doing that. And instantly, like early on, freshman year, and instantly being like, oh, no, that's not for me. And so for 4 years, I tried to run away from it. And obviously, I didn't run very far or very fast. And so eventually, I said, all right, God, if this is what you're calling me to, I'll give it a try. And the nice thing about religious formation is it's a process, right? Like before you profess, it's a process. And so that's, I think, ultimately what led me to that, I should say.
I think we'll probably have to stop now.
Sure, yeah, no, thank you
very much.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. I know I had to sort of speed read through, so like I'm happy to talk, continue talking. I have my email here if people want to continue the conversation or check out some other things, and then make sure there's pamphlets back there if you want to know more